Alexander Brooks stood at the window of his penthouse office, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the polished floor as the setting sun painted London's skyline in hues of amber and gold. At 32, he had everything money could buy: a thriving tech empire, a collection of luxury cars, and a property portfolio that would make real estate moguls envious. Yet, as he watched the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk, he felt the familiar hollow ache in his chest. His mobile buzzed, another message from his executive assistant reminding him about dinner with potential investors. Alexander sighed, adjusting his bespoke suit. These dinners had become a monotonous ritual, filled with fake smiles and hollow conversations. He had grown weary of people whose interest in him extended only as far as his bank balance. The restaurant his assistant had chosen was different from their usual haunts. Instead of the sterile modernity of Mayfair's finest establishments, this place was nestled in a quiet corner of Notting Hill, its warm lights spilling onto the cobblestone street. The sign above the door read, "La Maison Rouge," in elegant hand-painted letters. As Alexander pushed open the heavy wooden door, the gentle notes of jazz piano wrapped around him like a warm embrace. The interior was a careful balance of rustic charm and refined elegance, with exposed brick walls adorned with vintage French posters and tables draped in crisp white linens. Crystal glasses caught the light from wrought-iron chandeliers, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the ceiling. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to La Maison Rouge." The voice that greeted him was warm and genuine, lacking the practiced polish he had grown accustomed to. Alexander turned to find himself looking into the most captivating brown eyes he had ever seen. The woman before him wore a simple black dress, her dark hair gathered in an elegant knot at the nape of her neck. Her name tag read, "Sophie Bennett." "I believe your party has already arrived," Sophie continued, her smile reaching her eyes. "Please, follow me." As they walked through the restaurant, Alexander found himself studying her. There was something refreshingly authentic about the way she moved, the way she greeted other diners with genuine warmth. She didn't seem to recognize him, which was unusual in London's high-end restaurant scene, where maitre d's typically fawned over him. The business dinner proceeded as expected. Discussions of market shares, growth projections, and strategic partnerships. But Alexander found his attention repeatedly drawn to Sophie, who moved through the restaurant with grace and efficiency. He observed how she handled a spilled wine crisis at another table with calm competence, making the embarrassed guest feel at ease with a gentle joke and swift action. When his dining companions finally left, Alexander lingered over his coffee, watching Sophie guide an elderly couple to their table, taking extra time to ensure they were comfortable. She caught his eye and approached his table. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" "Actually, yes," Alexander heard himself say. "I'd like to make a regular reservation. Same table every Thursday at 8. Sophie raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of her mouth. "Every Thursday? That's quite a commitment." "I appreciate consistency," he replied, surprising himself with his honesty. "And this place, it has character." "That it does," Sophie agreed, pulling out her booking diary. As she wrote down his details, Alexander noticed that she didn't react to his name. Either she was exceptionally professional, or she genuinely didn't know who he was. The thought was oddly refreshing. "There you are, Mr. Brooks, every Thursday at 8. Though I should warn you, we change our menu regularly. You might have to be a bit adventurous." "I think I can handle that," he replied, a genuine smile tugging at his lips for the first time that evening. As Alexander stepped out into the cool London night, he found himself looking forward to next Thursday with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. The city seemed different somehow, warmer, more alive. He declined his driver's offer to pick him up, choosing instead to walk through the lamp-lit streets, his mind filled with thoughts of brown eyes and genuine smiles. Little did he know that this simple dinner reservation would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything he thought he knew about love, trust, and the true meaning of wealth. As he walked home that night, the stars above London seemed to twinkle with the promise of new beginnings, while somewhere in the city, Sophie Bennett was closing up the restaurant, unaware that her life was about to change forever. Chapter 2. Dreams and Reality. Sophie Bennett's tiny flat in Shepherd's Bush was a far cry from Alexander Brooks's penthouse, but to her it was home. The morning after their first encounter, she sat at her small kitchen table, steam rising from her cup of tea as she carefully reviewed her savings account balance. The numbers hadn't changed much since last month, but she remained optimistic. Every pound saved brought her closer to her dream. On the wall beside her hung a carefully crafted vision board filled with magazine cutouts and photographs. At its center was a picture of a charming storefront with a for sale sign which she'd photographed during one of her walks through Notting Hill. Below it were photos of her parents, their faces creased with loving smiles, standing in front of their modest home in Manchester. Her phone buzzed with a message from her mother. "How's my future restaurant owner doing today?" "Dad and I miss you." Sophie smiled, typing back a cheerful response while carefully avoiding mentioning how tight money was this month. Her parents had sacrificed enough for her dreams. They didn't need to worry. At work that evening, Sophie couldn't help but think about their unusual new Thursday regular. There was something different about Alexander Brooks, something that set him apart from their typical wealthy clientele. Despite his obviously expensive suit and watch, he had seemed almost uncomfortable with the trappings of luxury, as if he were wearing a costume that didn't quite fit. The week passed in a blur of service shifts and late-night planning sessions for her future restaurant. Sophie had filled countless notebooks with ideas, menu concepts, interior designs, cost projections. During quiet moments at work, she would sketch table layouts on spare order pads, earning fond smiles from her colleagues who had become like family over the past 2 years. Thursday arrived, and with it came Alexander Brooks, precisely at 8 o'clock. This time he was alone. Sophie led him to his table, noticing how his shoulders relaxed as he stepped into the restaurant's warm atmosphere. "No business associates tonight, Mr. Brooks?" she asked as she handed him the menu. "Just me," he replied, looking up at her with interest. "I thought I might try that adventurous menu you mentioned." Sophie found herself sharing the chef's specialities with genuine enthusiasm, describing each dish with the kind of passion that came from truly loving food and the stories behind it. To her surprise, Alexander listened intently, asking questions that showed real curiosity rather than polite interest. "Oh, you know a lot about food," he observed as she finished describing a particularly complex dish. "It's my passion," Sophie admitted, then added with a small laugh, "though I suppose everyone in this industry says that." "No," Alexander replied, studying her face. "Not everyone means it the way you do." Their conversation was interrupted by other diners requiring attention, but throughout the evening, Sophie found herself drawn back to his table. They shared brief exchanges about food, wine, and the history of the restaurant building. Alexander, she discovered, had an unexpected knowledge of London's architectural heritage. As the evening wound down, Sophie was surprised to find Alexander still there, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the restaurant's routine with evident fascination. When she brought his bill, he hesitated before speaking. "Would you be interested in getting coffee sometime?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty she wouldn't have expected from someone of his apparent success. "To discuss food and restaurants, of course," he added quickly. Sophie felt a flutter of surprise followed by caution. She had learned early in her career to be wary of customers who showed personal interest, but something about Alexander's awkward sincerity made her pause. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Brooks, but I make it a policy not to date customers," she replied gently. "Who said anything about dating?" he responded with a slight smile. "I'm merely suggesting a professional consultation. I happen to have some experience in business development, and you clearly have a passion for restaurants. Perhaps we could have a mutually beneficial conversation." Sophie found herself returning his smile, appreciating the clever way he'd reframed the invitation. "In that case, Mr. Brooks, I suppose a coffee wouldn't hurt. Purely professional, of course." They arranged to meet at a small cafe the following afternoon, and as Sophie watched Alexander leave the restaurant, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She told herself it was just the prospect of getting business advice from someone successful, but deep down, she knew there was something more to it. That night, as she updated her financial planning spreadsheet, Sophie found herself wondering about Alexander Brooks. There was a sadness behind his confident exterior, a loneliness she recognized from her own quiet moments. But she quickly pushed these thoughts aside. She had worked too hard and come too far to let herself be distracted by a handsome face and kind eyes, no matter how intriguing they might be. Chapter 3. coffee and confessions. The cafe where Sophie and Alexander agreed to meet was a quaint establishment, tucked away in a quiet corner of Covent Garden. It was a far cry from the sleek coffee shops that populated the financial district, with mismatched vintage furniture and the comforting aroma of freshly baked pastries filling the air. Sophie arrived early, choosing a worn leather armchair near the window. She had dressed carefully in her most professional outfit, a navy blue blazer over a simple white blouse paired with dark jeans. Her notebook, filled with carefully crafted business plans and menu ideas, sat on her lap like a shield. Alexander arrived precisely on time, looking somewhat out of place in his bespoke suit. Several heads turned as he entered, but he seemed oblivious to the attention. His face brightened when he spotted Sophie, and she noticed he had the same genuine smile she'd seen at the restaurant. "I hope you don't mind the venue," Sophie said, as he settled into the chair opposite her. "They make the best cinnamon rolls in London." "I trust your judgment when it comes to food," he replied, loosening his tie slightly. "Though I have to admit, this isn't my usual type of place." They ordered Sophie's recommendation of cinnamon rolls along with their coffee, and an initially awkward silence settled between them. Sophie found herself studying Alexander more closely in the natural daylight. There were subtle signs of strain around his eyes, despite his polished appearance. "So," Alexander began, "tell me about your restaurant dreams." Something about his gentle encouragement made Sophie's carefully maintained professional demeanor soften. She opened her notebook and began sharing her vision, a fusion of traditional British comfort food with modern techniques, a place where families could gather and create memories over meals that told stories. "The location I have in mind is actually not far from La Maison Rouge," she explained, showing him the photograph she kept in her notebook. "It's been empty for months, but the asking price—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "May I?" Alexander asked, gesturing to her detailed financial projections. As he reviewed them, his expression grew increasingly impressed. "These are remarkably thorough. Most people I meet with haven't done half this level of research. I've had 3 years to plan," Sophie admitted. "Every spare moment, every extra pound, it all goes toward this dream. My parents taught me the value of careful planning." Alexander's expression shifted at the mention of parents. "Tell me about them," he said softly. Sophie found herself sharing stories about her childhood in Manchester, about her father, a schoolteacher who spent weekends teaching her to cook family recipes, and her mother, a nurse who worked extra shifts to send her to culinary courses. She told him about their small house, which had always been filled with the aroma of home-cooked meals and laughter. "They sound wonderful," Alexander said, a hint of something like longing in his voice. "They are," Sophie agreed. "They've sacrificed so much for me. Part of my dream is to be able to give them the comfortable retirement they deserve." She hesitated before adding, "What about your family?" A shadow crossed Alexander's face. "It's complicated. My father built an empire, and I was expected to expand it. Everything in my life has been about living up to that legacy." "That sounds lonely," Sophie said softly, surprising both of them with her directness. Their eyes met, and for a moment the bustling cafe seemed to fade away. Alexander looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead he turned back to her business plan. "Your concept is solid," he said, his voice professional once again. "But there are ways to streamline these operational costs, may I?" He pulled out a pen, and together they spent the next hour going through her projections. As they worked, Sophie couldn't help but notice how Alexander came alive when discussing business strategy. His suggestions were insightful, but never condescending, and he seemed genuinely excited by her ideas. "Thank you," Sophie said, as they finally gathered their things. "This has been incredibly helpful." "I should be thanking you," Alexander replied. "This is the most honest conversation I've had in months." He paused, then added, "Would you consider meeting again? There's more we could discuss about supplier relationships and marketing strategies." Sophie hesitated. The professional pretense was wearing thin, and they both knew it. Yet there was something about Alexander that made her want to know more, to understand the man behind the successful facade. "Same time next week," she suggested, surprising herself. "But this time let me cook for you. There's a small market kitchen where I sometimes test recipes. It would give you a better idea of my culinary philosophy." The smile that lit up Alexander's face made her heart skip a beat. "I'd like that very much," he said. As they parted ways outside the cafe, neither of them noticed the man watching from across the street, his expression darkening as he observed their friendly goodbye. Marcus Sterling, Alexander's former business partner and current rival, lifted his phone and took several photos before disappearing into the crowd. Chapter 4. Stirring the Pot. The market kitchen was Sophie's sanctuary, a place where she could experiment with recipes and techniques without the pressure of service hours. She had arranged to use it on her day off and spent the morning carefully preparing for Alexander's visit. The small space was filled with the aromas of herbs and spices as Sophie moved confidently between stations, checking the slow-cooked beef that had been braising for hours and putting the finishing touches on a starter of hand-dived scallops with cauliflower puree. Alexander arrived exactly on time carrying a bottle of wine. He had dressed down for the occasion in dark jeans and a cashmere jumper that made him look younger and more approachable. His eyes widened as he took in the array of ingredients and equipment. "This is quite an operation," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Can I help?" Sophie suppressed a smile at the image of the tech millionaire chopping vegetables. "Have you ever done any cooking? Does making coffee count?" he asked with a self-deprecating grin. "Right then, we'll start with the basics." Sophie handed him an apron and began teaching him how to properly hold a knife. The evening took on an unexpected intimacy as they worked side by side in the small kitchen, their shoulders occasionally brushing as Sophie guided his hands through the proper cutting techniques. "My father would be horrified to see me now," Alexander commented as he carefully diced carrots. "He always said the kitchen was no place for a Brooks man." "And what do you think?" Sophie asked, noting how he tensed at the mention of his father. "I think—" Alexander paused, considering. "I think I've spent too much time worrying about what my father would think." As they worked, Sophie shared stories about her experiences in various kitchens, from her first job as a teenager to her current position at La Maison Rouge. Alexander, in turn, opened up about the pressure of taking over his father's company at 25 and the loneliness of success. "The higher you climb," he said, stirring the sauce Sophie had taught him to make, "the harder it becomes to trust people's motives. Everyone wants something." "Not everyone," Sophie replied softly, their eyes meeting over the steam of the cooking pots. The moment was interrupted by Alexander's phone buzzing insistently. He checked it and frowned. "Sorry, I need to take this." He stepped outside, leaving Sophie to put the finishing touches on their meal. Through the kitchen window she could see him pacing, his relaxed demeanor replaced by tension. When he returned, his face was troubled. "Is everything all right?" she asked, plating the scallops with practiced precision. "Just business," he replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing that can't wait until tomorrow." But Sophie noticed how he checked his phone repeatedly throughout the meal, his earlier openness gradually replaced by preoccupation. Despite this, dinner was a success. Alexander's genuine appreciation for each dish made Sophie's heart swell with pride. As they shared the chocolate soufflé she'd prepared for dessert, he finally seemed to relax again. "This is incredible," he said, savoring each bite. "You have a real gift, Sophie." "It's not just about the food," she explained, warming to her favorite topic. "It's about creating moments, memories. That's what I want my restaurant to be. A place where people can forget their troubles and just enjoy being together." "Like tonight," Alexander said softly, his eyes meeting hers across the table. The air between them crackled with unspoken possibilities. Sophie felt herself leaning slightly forward, drawn by the intensity of his gaze. But before either could act on the moment, Alexander's phone buzzed again, this time with a news alert. His face paled as he read the screen. "I have to go," he said abruptly, standing up. "I'm sorry, but this is urgent." "Of course," Sophie replied, trying to hide her disappointment. "Is everything okay?" "It's fine," he said, but his tone was unconvincing. "Thank you for tonight. It was perfect." He hesitated, then quickly kissed her cheek before hurrying out. Left alone in the kitchen, Sophie began cleaning up, her mind whirling with questions. As she packed away the leftover food, her own phone pinged with a notification. It was a link to a business news website sent by her friend and colleague at the restaurant. The headline made her blood run cold. "Tech titan Alexander Brooks. Empire on the brink of collapse? Sources reveal massive financial troubles." Sophie sank into a chair, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through the article. According to anonymous sources, Alexander's company was facing bankruptcy, and his entire fortune might be nothing more than smoke and mirrors. Chapter 5. Shattered Trust. The following days passed in a blur of headlines and speculation. Sophie found herself obsessively checking news sites, each article painting a darker picture of Alexander's situation. His company's stock was plummeting, and rumors of massive debt and mismanagement filled the financial pages. At La Maison Rouge, Thursday came and went without any sign of Alexander. His reserve table remained empty, a silent testament to the chaos unfolding in his life. Sophie tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept wandering to their last evening together in the market kitchen. "You seem distracted," remarked Claire, one of the senior waitresses, as they prepared for the evening service. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your mysterious Thursday regular, would it?" Sophie was saved from responding by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Marcus Sterling walked into the restaurant with the confidence of someone who owned the place, his expensive suit and perfectly styled hair marking him as another member of London's elite. "Miss Bennet?" he asked, approaching the reception desk. "I wonder if I might have a word." Sophie led him to a quiet corner table, her instincts telling her this wasn't a casual visit. Marcus ordered an espresso and waited until they were alone before speaking. "I understand you've become quite friendly with Alexander Brooks," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "I feel obligated to warn you about him. We were business partners once, you see." "Were?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice neutral. Marcus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Alexander has a talent for deception. He presents himself as this self-made tech genius, but the truth is far less glamorous. His father's money built that empire, and now—" He shrugged eloquently. "Well, you've seen the news." "I'm not sure why you're telling me this," Sophie said carefully, "because I've seen good people hurt by Alexander's games before. He has a pattern, you see. When things get difficult, he creates elaborate stories to manipulate those around him. Did he tell you about his company's troubles?" Sophie's silence was answer enough. Marcus nodded sympathetically. "Let me guess. He painted himself as the victim of circumstance, perhaps even hinted at needing help." He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. "These are records of his recent property purchases and expenditures. It's not exactly the actions of someone in financial distress." Sophie's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were photographs of Alexander at high-end events, documentation of recent luxury purchases, and bank statements showing massive transfers to offshore accounts. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because unlike Alexander, I believe in honesty." Marcus reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "I'm planning to launch a new restaurant venture. Given your reputation in the industry, I'd be interested in discussing potential opportunities. No games, no manipulation, just straight business." After Marcus left, Sophie retreated to the staff room, her mind spinning. She thought about the evening in the market kitchen, about Alexander's phone calls and abrupt departure. Had it all been part of some elaborate scheme? Her phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Can we meet? I need to explain everything." Sophie stared at the message for a long time before replying. "I think you've explained enough." That evening, she threw herself into her work with renewed determination, but her usual joy in the restaurant's atmosphere was missing. Every time the door opened, she caught herself looking up, hoping and dreading that it might be Alexander. As she was closing up, Claire approached her with a concerned expression. "There's something you should see," she said, holding out her tablet. On the screen was a video from a financial news website showing Alexander at a press conference earlier that day. "I want to address the rumors about my company's financial status," he was saying, his voice steady but his eyes tired. "While we are facing some challenges, reports of our impending collapse have been greatly exaggerated. We remain solvent and committed to our employees and stakeholders." The camera panned to show Marcus Sterling in the audience, his expression unreadable. As Sophie watched, she noticed something odd. Alexander was wearing the same suit he'd worn the day they'd first met at La Maison Rouge. The video wasn't from today at all. It was from weeks ago. She began digging through the articles about Alexander's supposed financial troubles. Most cited anonymous sources close to the company, but offered no concrete evidence. The more she looked, the more holes she found in the story. That night, Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, surrounded by printouts of news articles and Marcus's documents. Her parents had always taught her that truth was found in actions, not words. She thought about Alexander's genuine interest in her dreams, his awkward attempts at cooking, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about helping others. Just as she was about to call Alexander, her phone rang. It was an unknown number, but she answered anyway. "Sophie Bennett," a familiar voice asked. "This is Richard Brooks, Alexander's father. We need to talk about my son." Chapter 6. Family Matters. Richard Brooks had arranged to meet Sophie at his private club in St. James's, a place where old money whispered through wood-paneled walls and leather-bound books. Sophie felt distinctly out of place as she was led through the hushed corridors to a secluded sitting room. Alexander's father was exactly as she had imagined him, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the same intense blue eyes as his son. But where Alexander's gaze held warmth, Richard's was cold and calculating. "Please, sit," he said, gesturing to an antique armchair. "I'll be direct, Miss Bennett. I understand you've become quite close to my son." "Mr. Brooks," Sophie began, but he held up a hand to silence her. "Let me finish. Alexander has always been idealistic. He believes in changing the world through technology, making things better for everyone," he said with a slight sneer. "But business isn't about making the world better. It's about power, about winning." He poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, not offering one to Sophie. "The current situation with our company's stock price is unfortunate, but it's also an opportunity, one that Alexander refuses to seize." "I'm not sure I understand what this has to do with me," Sophie said carefully. Richard Brooks smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My son has been distracted lately, spending time in modest restaurants, discussing small business ventures, entertaining romantic notions. Meanwhile, our competitors are circling like vultures." He slid a check across the coffee table between them. Sophie glanced at it and felt her breath catch. The amount was more than enough to buy the restaurant property she'd been dreaming of, with plenty left over. "I'm offering you a chance to pursue your dreams, Miss Bennett. All I ask in return is that you remove yourself from my son's life. Quietly, of course." Sophie stared at the check, her hands clenched in her lap. "You think I can be bought? Everyone can be bought, my dear. It's simply a matter of finding the right price." He leaned forward. "Alexander is the heir to a billion-pound technology empire. Did you really think this little romance of yours had a future?" "With all due respect, Mr. Brooks," Sophie said, standing up, "you don't know me at all. And from what I've seen, you don't know your son either." She walked out of the club with her head held high, but her composure cracked as soon as she reached the street. Tears blurred her vision as she hurried through the evening crowds, nearly colliding with someone on the pavement. "Sophie?" Alexander's voice cut through her distress. He was standing outside a coffee shop, concern etched on his face. "What's wrong? What are you doing in this part of town?" Looking at him, the genuine worry in his eyes, the way he instinctively reached for her, Sophie made a decision. "We need to talk," she said, "about everything." They found a quiet corner in the coffee shop, and Sophie told him about Marcus's visit, the documents, and her meeting with his father. Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "I should have told you everything from the beginning," he said finally. "The truth is, my company is facing challenges, but not because we're failing. We're changing direction, moving away from profit-driven technology towards sustainable and socially responsible initiatives. My father and the board, they don't approve." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Marcus was my partner in developing the new direction, but he switched sides when my father offered him a better deal. The news stories, the stock price manipulation, it's all part of their strategy to force me out." "Why didn't you tell me?" Sophie asked softly. "Because for the first time in my life, someone was interested in me, not my money or my company. When I'm with you, talking about your dreams, learning to cook, I can just be myself. I didn't want to drag you into this mess." Sophie reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm already in this mess. The question is, do we face it together or apart?" Alexander squeezed her hand, his eyes lighting up with determination. "Together. But you should know, choosing to stand with me won't be easy. My father and Marcus, they'll try to discredit you, possibly even interfere with your career. I've worked in restaurant kitchens since I was 16, Sophie said with a small smile. I can handle a little heat. As they sat there planning their next moves, neither of them noticed the photographer across the street or the fact that their entire conversation had been recorded by a device hidden in the sugar bowl on their table. In his office high above the city, Marcus Sterling smiled as he listened to the recording. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Soon, he would have enough ammunition to destroy not just Alexander's reputation, but Sophie's as well. Chapter 7. Testing the Waters. The weekend following Sophie and Alexander's coffee shop conversation, Manchester's autumn rain painted the windows of the Bennett family home in streaks of silver. Sophie had decided it was time to introduce Alexander to her parents, though she hadn't told them about his true identity or the complicated situation they were facing. "Are you sure about this?" Alexander asked as they pulled up to the modest semi-detached house in his least conspicuous car, a simple Volkswagen he kept for occasions when he needed to blend in. "They're my family," Sophie replied, squeezing his hand. "If we're going to face whatever's coming together, they need to know." Margaret Bennett opened the door before they could ring the bell, enveloping her daughter in a warm embrace that smelled of fresh baking and home. Sophie's father, James, appeared behind her, his teacher's spectacles slightly askew as he carried a stack of marking papers. "You must be Alexander," Margaret said warmly, pulling him into an unexpected hug. "Sophie's told us so much about you, though notably not that you're Alexander Brooks of Brooks Technology," James added quietly, causing everyone to freeze. He held up that morning's newspaper, which featured a business section article about Alexander's company. The atmosphere in the living room grew tense as Sophie and Alexander explained everything: the situation with his company, Marcus's manipulation, and Richard Brooks's attempt to buy Sophie off. Throughout the story, Margaret's expression grew increasingly concerned, while James remained unreadable. "Well," James said finally, "it seems you two have found yourselves in quite a situation." He removed his glasses and cleaned them thoughtfully. "You know, Sophie, this reminds me of something that happened to our family years ago." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She knew the story he was about to tell. It was one of the reasons she'd been so careful with money all these years. "When Sophie was 14, James continued, looking at Alexander, "my brother-in-law convinced us to invest our savings in his business venture. He showed us paperwork, projections. Everything looked perfect. We trusted him because he was family." Margaret picked up the thread. "We lost everything. Our savings, the money for Sophie's university fund, nearly lost this house. Had to start from scratch." Alexander looked at Sophie, understanding dawning in his eyes. "That's why you're so passionate about financial planning for your restaurant." Sophie nodded. "We learned the hard way that trust has to be earned, not just given." "Which brings us to you, young man," James said, leaning forward in his chair. "Our daughter trusts you, despite a situation that bears some concerning similarities to what we went through. The question is, have you earned that trust?" Alexander met James's gaze steadily. "I'm not sure I have, sir, but I'd like the chance to try." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a USB drive. "This contains every financial record of my company for the past 5 years, including my personal accounts. Complete transparency. I want you to have it." James studied the drive for a long moment before speaking. "That's a start, but what are your intentions regarding our daughter's dreams?" "Sophie's worked too hard to have them derailed by corporate politics." "Actually," Alexander replied, "I have some ideas about that." He pulled out his tablet and opened a presentation. "I've been working on this since our first coffee meeting." For the next hour, Alexander walked them through his plan, a way to secure Sophie's restaurant dream while protecting it from any potential fallout from his corporate battles. He'd created a blind trust structure that would ensure the restaurant remained solely in Sophie's control, regardless of what happened with his company. Margaret disappeared into the kitchen and returned with tea and fresh scones. As they ate, the conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. Alexander found himself drawn into a heated but friendly debate with James about educational technology, while Sophie and her mother discussed potential restaurant locations. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave, Margaret pulled Sophie aside while Alexander helped James with the dishes. "He's different from what I expected," Margaret said, watching Alexander through the kitchen door. "When we realized who he was, I was worried he'd be like those businessmen on television, all flash and no substance. But the way he looks at you— Mum, Sophie interrupted, do you think I'm being naive? After what happened with Uncle Robert— Love always involves risk, sweetheart, Margaret replied, hugging her daughter. The question is whether it's worth it. Only you can answer that. As they drove back to London through the rain-slicked motorway, Sophie noticed Alexander seemed lost in thought. Everything all right? She asked. Your parents are remarkable people, he said softly. The way they rebuilt after what happened, how they supported your dreams despite their own setbacks— I think I understand you better now. And, Sophie prompted, and I think it's time I stopped playing defense against my father and Marcus. Tomorrow morning I'm calling an emergency board meeting. No more hiding, no more manipulation. We're going to face this head on. Sophie reached over and took his hand, but before she could respond, Alexander's phone rang through the car's speaker system. It was his assistant, her voice urgent. Mr. Brooks, I'm sorry to disturb you, but there's been a leak. Someone's released emails to the press, personal emails between you and Sophie. They're everywhere. Chapter 8, Public and Private. The next morning, Sophie could barely focus as she prepared for her shift at La Maison Rouge. Her phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from friends and colleagues, all asking about the leaked emails. Social media was ablaze with speculation about her relationship with Alexander, with some suggesting she was a gold digger, while others painted her as an unwitting pawn in a corporate power struggle. The emails themselves were innocent enough, discussions about recipes, plans for coffee meetings, their shared dreams for the future. But taken out of context and sprinkled with carefully crafted commentary, they painted a picture of calculated manipulation on both sides. You don't have to work today, Claire said as Sophie arrived at the restaurant. Marcel would understand if you needed time off. No, Sophie replied firmly, tying her apron. I won't hide, I haven't done anything wrong. But the shift proved challenging. Some regular customers treated her with obvious disdain, while others tried to pump her for gossip about Alexander. The final straw came when a group of business journalists attempted to make a booking, clearly hoping to observe her in her natural habitat. Marcel, the restaurant's owner, called her into his office during the afternoon lull. His usually jovial face was creased with concern. Sophie, ma chérie, we need to talk about this situation. He gestured for her to sit. I received a very interesting phone call this morning from Marcus Sterling. He wants to buy La Maison Rouge. Sophie felt her heart sink. What did you say? I told him that my restaurant is not for sale, but he was most insistent, suggesting that recent publicity might damage our reputation. Marcel's eyes twinkled with mischief. I reminded him that in Paris, where I learned my craft, reputation is built on food and hospitality, not gossip. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. Marcel, I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble to your door. No, no, he waved away her apology. You are family here. Besides, he added with a wink, this drama is good for business. We are fully booked for next month. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the dining room. Sophie emerged from the office to find Alexander standing in the entrance, surrounded by photographers and reporters. Despite the chaos, he remained composed, his eyes searching for her. Mr. Brooks, a reporter called out, is it true that Sophie Bennett was planted in this restaurant as part of your strategy to maintain control of your company? Miss Bennett, another shouted. Did you know about the company's financial situation when you began dating Alexander Brooks? Alexander raised his hands for silence. I came here today not as the CEO of Brooks Technology, but as a man who has been privileged to know an extraordinary woman. Sophie Bennett's integrity, talent, and dedication to her craft speak for themselves. Anyone suggesting otherwise clearly hasn't had the pleasure of experiencing her cooking. He turned to Sophie, who had moved to stand beside him. I'm sorry, he said quietly. This is exactly what I didn't want to happen. Then let's give them something real to talk about, Sophie replied. She turned to address the crowd. Yes, I'm dating Alexander Brooks. Yes, I work as a receptionist while pursuing my dream of opening my own restaurant. And no, I won't apologize for either of those things. Marcel stepped forward, clapping his hands. Excellent. Now who would like to stay for lunch? Our special today is coq au vin, prepared by the talented Miss Bennett herself, though I must insist, no cameras in the dining room. The tension broke as several reporters chuckled and the crowd began to disperse. Alexander pulled Sophie into a quiet corner. "The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning," he said. "I have a plan, but I need your help. Do you still have access to that market kitchen?" Sophie nodded, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "I think it's time we showed everyone what's really possible when technology and hospitality work together." He paused, then added, "But first, there's something else we need to discuss. Those leaked emails. There's only one way Marcus could have gotten them. Someone at your company." Alexander shook his head. "The emails were on a secure server. The only other person with access was my father. He's working with Marcus, Sophie. They're trying to force me out together." Before Sophie could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Just saw the news. Your father's on his way to London. Says he has something important to tell you both about Robert's case." Sophie showed the message to Alexander, whose eyes widened with understanding. "Your uncle's business scandal. You don't think that it might be connected to all this?" Sophie finished. "Only one way to find out." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. James Bennett arrived at the market kitchen later that evening, carrying a worn leather briefcase that Sophie recognized from his teaching days. Alexander had arranged for them to meet there, away from prying eyes and press cameras. The small space felt crowded with tension as James spread old documents across the steel prep table. "I've kept these all these years," James said, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened a yellowed folder. "After what happened with Robert, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story." Sophie moved closer to examine the papers, Alexander at her side. The documents detailed her Uncle Robert's failed business venture, investment reports, bank statements, and correspondence that had devastated her family years ago. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a company name that appeared repeatedly in the paperwork. "Sterling Ventures Limited. I never made the connection before, but when I saw Marcus Sterling's name in the papers today..." Alexander leaned forward, his expression intense. Sterling Ventures was Marcus's father's company. They specialized in hostile takeovers of struggling businesses in the early 2000s. "Robert always insisted he was set up." Margaret's voice came from the doorway as she joined them, carrying containers of home-cooked food. "But we were too angry, too hurt to listen." Sophie watched as Alexander examined the documents with growing concern. "These signatures," he said, pointing to several pages. "They're almost identical to ones I've seen on recent board documents. Marcus hasn't changed his methods, just updated them for the digital age." "But why?" Sophie asked, looking between her parents and Alexander. "Why target our family back then?" James pulled out another document, this one newer. "I requested all records related to Robert's case last week. Look at what happened to the property he lost, the one that was supposed to be the site of his business." Alexander's eyes widened as he read. "It was purchased by a subsidiary of Brooks International, my father's company." The revelation hung heavy in the air. Sophie's mind raced, connecting dots she never knew existed. So Marcus's father targeted small businesses, forced them into bankruptcy, and my father's company swooped in to acquire the properties at a fraction of their value, Alexander finished. "They've been working together for decades." "But why come after you now?" Margaret asked, beginning to unpack the food she'd brought. Even in crisis, her instinct to nurture remained strong. Alexander ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Because I've been trying to change how Brooks Technology operates, moving away from predatory business practices, focusing on sustainable development and community support. My father sees it as betraying his legacy." "And Marcus," Sophie prompted. "He was supposed to help me modernize the company. I trusted him." Alexander's voice was bitter. "But it seems he's more interested in following in his father's footsteps." James spread more documents across the table. "There's something else. Robert managed to hide some records before everything fell apart. Records that prove the Sterling Ventures takeover was fraudulent. That's why they're moving so aggressively now," Alexander realized. "If these documents become public, it wouldn't just expose their past schemes, it would make their current tactics obvious." Sophie's phone buzzed with a news alert. Her heart sank as she read it. "They're not waiting. Marcus just announced a press conference for tomorrow morning, right before your board meeting. He's promising to reveal shocking evidence of corruption at the heart of Brooks Technology." Alexander's expression hardened with determination. "Then we need to move faster. Mr. Bennett, may I take these documents? I have an idea, but we'll need to work through the night." "We'll help," Sophie said firmly, already reaching for her chef's apron. "What's the plan?" "Something my father never understood," Alexander replied, a slight smile playing at his lips. "The power of bringing people together. Sophie, remember what you said about your restaurant dream? About creating a place where people could share not just food, but stories and truths?" Sophie nodded, beginning to understand. "You want to use the board meeting to tell a story they can't ignore, but we'll need help." He turned to James and Margaret. "Would you be willing to speak about what happened with Robert? To share your story?" Margaret reached for her husband's hand. It's time the truth came out. As they worked through the night, Sophie's kitchen skills were put to unexpected use. She coordinated with Claire and Marcel to arrange catering for an impromptu breakfast meeting, while Alexander and her father organized the documents into a compelling narrative. Margaret worked the phone, reaching out to other families who had been affected by Sterling Ventures' schemes over the years. By dawn, they had assembled not just evidence, but a powerful testament to the human cost of corporate greed and a vision for a different way of doing business. As the sun rose over London, Sophie looked around the kitchen at her unlikely team, her parents, still strong and resilient after all they'd been through. Alexander, his sleeves rolled up and his tie long discarded, working with genuine passion. And herself, standing at a crossroads between her past and future. "Whatever happens today," she said, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, "we face it together." Alexander looked up from his papers, his eyes meeting hers with warmth and determination. "Together," he agreed, "though I should warn you, my father isn't going to go down without a fight." Chapter 10. The Breaking Dawn. The Brooks Technology headquarters gleamed in the early morning light, its glass and steel facade reflecting the sunrise like a mirror. In the building's grand atrium, Sophie and her team had transformed the space into something warmer, more human. Round tables replaced the usual corporate setup, each one set with care and consideration. The aroma of freshly baked pastries and brewing coffee filled the air as board members, journalists, and other influential figures began to arrive. Each guest was personally greeted by Sophie, who had traded her chef's whites for a simple but elegant dress that Claire had helped her choose. "They're here," Alexander murmured, appearing at her side. Sophie turned to see Richard Brooks and Marcus Sterling entering together, their confident expressions faltering slightly at the unexpected scene before them. "What is this?" Richard demanded, approaching his son. "The board meeting was scheduled for 9, and it still is," Alexander replied calmly. "But I thought we might all benefit from breaking bread together first. After all, isn't that what civilized people do when they have important matters to discuss?" Marcus's eyes narrowed as he spotted James and Margaret Bennett among the guests, along with several other familiar faces, people whose businesses had been affected by Sterling Ventures over the years. "This is highly irregular," he protested, but several board members were already being drawn into conversation with the guests, accepting coffee and pastries from the service staff Sophie had recruited from La Maison Rouge. As planned, Alexander took the podium at precisely 9 o'clock. The room fell silent, the intimate breakfast setting making his words feel more like a conversation than a corporate presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we're here today to discuss the future of Brooks Technology. But before we look forward, we need to understand our past." What followed was a masterfully orchestrated presentation. Alexander wove together the documentary evidence with personal testimonies, while Sophie and her parents shared their story. Other families came forward as well, each account building a devastating picture of corporate manipulation and human cost. Richard Brooks's face grew increasingly pale as the presentation continued. When Marcus attempted to interrupt, several board members shushed him, too engrossed in the unfolding narrative. "The question before us today," Alexander concluded, "is not just about quarterly profits or stock prices. It's about what kind of company we want to be, what kind of legacy we want to leave." He gestured to the breakfast setting around them. "This morning you've experienced something different. A way of doing business that brings people together, that creates value not just for shareholders, but for communities. This is the future I envision for Brooks Technology." "A future based on serving breakfast?" Marcus scoffed, but his attempt at derision fell flat. "A future based on human connection," Sophie stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "On understanding that every business decision affects real people with real dreams." Richard Brooks stood up, his face thunderous. This is ridiculous. The board didn't come here for some sort of moral lesson. We're here to discuss the company's direction. Actually, one of the senior board members spoke up. I think that's exactly what we're discussing. She turned to Alexander. Please continue. For the next hour, Alexander laid out his vision for Brooks Technology's future, a plan that combined innovative technology with social responsibility. He proposed partnerships with small businesses, including a pilot program that would start with Sophie's restaurant concept, using it as a model for how technology could support rather than supplant traditional enterprises. The board members listened intently, many taking notes. Even some of Richard's strongest supporters seemed swayed by the presentation's combination of solid business strategy and ethical vision. As the formal meeting drew to a close, Marcus made one last attempt to seize control. This is all very touching, he sneered, but it doesn't change the fact that the company's stock is plummeting. The market has lost confidence in Alexander's leadership. About that, Alexander smiled, nodding to his assistant who distributed fresh documents to the board. These are records proving that the recent stock volatility was artificially created through coordinated trading by shell companies linked to Sterling Ventures. The same pattern they've used before, just updated for the digital age. The room erupted in murmurs as the board members examined the evidence. Marcus's face turned ashen as he realized his own tactics had been turned against him. Richard Brooks stood abruptly. This meeting is adjourned. We need time to review all this. Information? Of course, Alexander agreed smoothly. Though you might want to review it quickly. I believe the financial press would be very interested in these documents. As the board members filed out, many stopped to speak with Sophie and her parents, expressing sympathy for their past experiences and interest in the proposed changes. Several even asked for Marcel's contact information, impressed by the morning's catering. When the room had finally cleared, Sophie found Alexander standing by the window, looking out over the city. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. He turned to her, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "I just stood up to my father for the first time in my life, exposed decades of corporate misconduct, potentially destroyed my relationship with my family forever, and yet, I've never felt more certain about anything." He took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you for showing me that there's more to life than winning at all costs." Their moment was interrupted by Alexander's assistant, rushing in with urgent news. The board had called for an emergency session, and a decision was about to be made that would change everything. Chapter 11. New Horizons. The board's emergency session lasted well into the afternoon. Sophie, her parents, and the La Maison Rouge staff cleared away the breakfast setting, transforming the atrium back into its usual corporate self. As they worked, Sophie couldn't help but glance frequently at the closed boardroom doors, wondering what was happening behind them. "You've done all you can," James said, placing a comforting hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Whatever happens now, you should be proud." Marcel, who had arrived earlier to help with the cleanup, approached with his characteristic dramatic flair. "Ma chérie, while we wait for news, perhaps we should discuss your notice period at La Maison Rouge." Sophie turned to him in surprise. "My notice period? But of course, after that breakfast service, the way you managed everything and everyone. Clearly you are ready to run your own establishment." He pulled out an envelope from his jacket. "Which is why I want to make you an offer." Before he could explain further, the boardroom doors opened. Board members filed out, their expressions unreadable. Alexander emerged last, his face tired but his eyes bright. Behind him, Richard Brooks and Marcus Sterling followed, both looking decidedly unhappy. "The board has reached several decisions," Alexander announced to the small group remaining in the atrium. "First, they've voted to maintain current leadership, with some additional oversight measures." Sophie released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Alexander continued, "They've also approved our new direction for the company, including the community partnership program." "This is a mistake," Richard Brooks interrupted. "You're dismantling everything I built." "No, father," Alexander replied quietly. "I'm building something new on the foundation you created, something that can make a real difference." "And what about the evidence of market manipulation?" James asked, looking pointedly at Marcus. "The board has referred all documentation to the appropriate authorities," Alexander said. "Marcus and his associates will need to answer some difficult questions." Marcus stepped forward, his composure cracking. "You don't understand what you've done. There are other documents, other deals that could come to light." "Then perhaps it's time they did," Richard Brooks said suddenly, surprising everyone. He turned to his son. "You were right about one thing, Alexander. The old way of doing business, perhaps it's time for a change." The tension in the room shifted as Richard approached James and Margaret Bennett. "I owe your family an apology. What happened with Robert, it was business, but it wasn't right." "An apology won't restore what we lost," Margaret replied firmly. "No," Richard agreed, "but perhaps we can work on making amends." He looked at his son. "If you'll allow me to be part of this new direction." Alexander studied his father for a long moment before nodding slowly. "We'll need experienced advisors who understand both the old and new ways of doing business." Marcel cleared his throat dramatically. "Speaking of new directions," he handed the envelope to Sophie. "I am retiring next year. La Maison Rouge needs new blood, new ideas. I want you to take over as owner and head chef." Sophie stared at the envelope in shock. "But I can't afford—" "We can work something out," Marcel smiled. "Perhaps with some help from this new community partnership program. After all, what better way to demonstrate its value than by preserving a beloved local institution while allowing it to grow?" Alexander stepped forward. "The board has already approved La Maison Rouge as our first partner business. If you're interested, of course." Sophie looked around at the faces watching her, her parents beaming with pride, Marcel's encouraging smile, Alexander's hopeful expression, and even Richard Brooks's newfound respect. "On one condition," she said firmly. "La Maison Rouge maintains its independence. Any partnership has to preserve its character, its heart." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Alexander agreed. "In fact, I have some ideas about how we could expand the concept while keeping its essential nature. A network of unique, community-focused restaurants, each with its own identity, but supported by shared resources and technology. Like a family," Sophie mused, "where each member is unique but supported by the whole." As the group began discussing possibilities, Marcus slipped away unnoticed. His own family's legacy of corporate manipulation was ending, but perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. He had his own decisions to make about the future. Later that evening, as the sun set over London, Sophie and Alexander stood in the market kitchen where their journey had begun. She was showing him the proper way to chop vegetables again, his technique only marginally improved from their first lesson. "You know," he said, carefully slicing a carrot, "we never did get to finish that dinner you were making the night everything fell apart." Sophie smiled, taking the knife from him and demonstrating the correct grip once more. "We have time now, all the time in the world, to get things right." Chapter 12. A place at the table. 1 year later. The evening air was crisp with early autumn as guests began arriving at La Maison Rouge. The restaurant had undergone subtle changes over the past year. The warm lighting remained, but new touches reflected Sophie's influence. The brick walls now featured photographs of the restaurant's history, alongside the vintage French posters, telling the story of its evolution. In the kitchen, Sophie moved with practiced confidence, directing her staff with the same warm authority she'd learned from Marcel. The technology Alexander had helped implement streamlined operations without detracting from the restaurant's personal touch. Tablets disguised as traditional menu boards, a reservation system that remembered guests' preferences, and a kitchen management system that helped reduce waste while maintaining quality. "Chef," Claire called from the door, "they're ready for you." Sophie took a deep breath, straightened her chef's jacket, and stepped into the dining room. The space had been transformed for tonight's special event, with tables arranged to create one long dining surface stretching through the restaurant. Faces both familiar and new turned to greet her, her parents beaming with pride. Marcel, now officially retired but still a regular presence, Alexander's father Richard, who had surprised everyone by becoming one of the restaurant's most enthusiastic supporters. And at the center of it all, Alexander stood waiting for her, his eyes shining with love and pride. "Ladies and gentlemen," he addressed the gathered crowd, "1 year ago, in a kitchen not far from here, a remarkable woman taught me that true success isn't measured by profit margins or stock prices, but by the connections we build and the lives we touch." Sophie took her place beside him, squeezing his hand as he continued. "Tonight, We're not just celebrating La Maison Rouge's most successful year to date, or the success of our community partnership program, which has now helped 20 other family-owned restaurants thrive in the digital age. We're celebrating the power of bringing people together, of sharing not just meals but stories, dreams, and lives. James Bennett stood up, raising his glass. To my daughter, who never gave up on her dreams, and to the man who helped make them reality, not by throwing money at them, but by understanding what really matters. To Sophie and Alexander, the crowd echoed, glasses clinking across the long table. As dinner was served, a carefully curated menu that told their story through food, conversations flowed freely. Property developers discussed community initiatives with local shop owners. Tech entrepreneurs shared ideas with traditional craftspeople, and at the heart of it all, two families who had once stood on opposite sides of a corporate divide now broke bread together as one. Marcel, ever the dramatic host even in retirement, called for attention as dessert was served. My friends, when I first met our Sophie, I knew she had something special. Not just skill in the kitchen, but understanding of what makes a restaurant truly great. It is not just the food, no. It is the heart, the soul, the story we create together. He turned to Sophie and Alexander. You have taken this understanding and made it grow. La Maison Rouge is more than a restaurant now. It is proof that tradition and progress can dance together, that success can be measured in smiles as well as pounds. After the guests had departed, Sophie and Alexander lingered in the quiet restaurant. The staff had gone home, leaving them alone with the gentle hum of the kitchen's cooling equipment and the soft glow of the dimmed lights. Do you remember that first night you came in? Sophie asked, running her hand along the smooth wood of what would always be Alexander's table in her mind. How could I forget? I was looking for a quiet place to escape, and instead, I found my future. Sophie smiled, leading him into the kitchen. Well, Mr. Brooks, your technique still needs work. Shall we have another lesson? Alexander caught her hand, pulling her close. Actually, I was hoping we might discuss a different kind of partnership. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the same one Sophie had used to sketch her restaurant dreams during their first coffee meeting. Opening it to the last page, he revealed a simple gold ring nestled in a hollow he'd carefully cut into the pages. Sophie Bennett, he said softly, you taught me that the best things in life aren't built on grand gestures or elaborate plans, but on simple truths and genuine connections. Will you marry me? Sophie's answer was interrupted by a commotion at the kitchen door. Their family and friends had returned, led by Margaret, who was unsuccessfully trying to quiet their excited whispers. Sorry, James called out, not looking sorry at all. Your mother insisted we couldn't miss this moment. Sophie laughed, tears of joy in her eyes as she turned back to Alexander. Yes, she said simply. 1,000 times yes. As cheers erupted and champagne was somehow produced from the kitchen stores, Sophie looked around at the happy faces surrounding them. This was what she'd always dreamed of creating, not just a successful restaurant, but a place where love, family, and community could flourish. Later, as they all gathered around the kitchen's prep table, sharing leftover desserts and trading stories, Sophie realized that her restaurant had become something even more special than she'd imagined. It was a place where barriers broke down, where corporate executives and kitchen staff could share a joke, where old wounds could heal and new beginnings could take root. It was, in every sense, a table where everyone belonged.